Hi. With push 3, Ableton's grid now becomes a fully expressive instrument with 3 dimensions of control per pad. So instead of just pressure, like in push 2, it now supports per pad slides, meaning up and down motion, and pitch bends, even between pads, as if it was a continuous surface. And beside that, they've added more buttons and encoders for expanded control. Besides per pad expressive control, push 3 now comes in 2 different versions. A controller that works with a computer, and a standalone version that doesn't require a computer, rather has one built inside with a battery. Push 3 also comes with a built-in audio interface, expandable via ADAT. In this video, I'll take a look at what's new compared to push 2, the workflow overall, pros and cons compared to the numerous categories in which this now competes, including controllers for Ableton Live, standalone production systems, and even standalone expressive instruments. Before I start, a quick disclosure. Ableton sent push 3 over for review. No money changed hands. They have no say over the content of this video and don't get to see it before it's published. Okay, first I'll focus on a comparison to push 2. If you're not familiar with what push is overall and what it can do, you might want to jump ahead to the overview section later in the video. Since push 2 has been around for a while, I'm going to assume you're vaguely familiar with what it's about and start with what's new in push 3 compared to push 2. There are quite a few big differences, but most material, I think, is that now each of the 64 pads is now a fully expressive 3D control surface. I've got a visualization of the 3 dimensions up on the screen. Push 2 had pressure sensitivity, as does this on a per pad basis. So there was polyphonic expression there, and there is on push 3 as well. But push 3 adds to that the slide motion, or the Y-axis motion, up and down the pad. You can see that on the slide visualizer. That's polyphonic as well. Beside that, each pad is sensitive to location on the X-axis, left and right motion. You can hear the subtle pitch bend, and if I increase the sensitivity, you'll be able to better see it and hear it. You can also customize how these pads behave quite a bit. Let's maybe choose a different sound. So if I go into the settings, these are the pad expression settings. If you don't want pitch bends between notes, you can just turn that off and get glissando. There's an auto mode and just a mode where it's always on. And this is all polyphonic. You can bend pitch differently per pad. You can choose to make the entire surface sort of fretless, so it'll be sensitive to where you press on the pad and tune accordingly, or just immediately tune to your finger's location, regardless of where you press, but still let you pitch bend from there. You've got control over how quickly you want it to get out of tune. So 1 or 0 millimeter basically makes it an entirely fretless surface, especially if we put it into pad mode. And if you want to be more in tune rather than less, you can choose an in-between setting. And you've also got control over slide sensitivity, meaning how much of the pad's surface you'll be able to slide across. And then finally, you've got a whole page dedicated to pressure sensitivity. These 3 dimensions of control, pressure, slide, and pitch bend, are increasingly becoming modulation sources for Ableton's different instruments. So this is the matrix for wavetable. And just as another example, let's go into drift. So this too has quite a few assignments you can make. Pressure, slide, and these appear in a few places across the synth. There are also plenty of MPE capable presets within push. So if we go into sounds, you'll find quite a few MPE sounds in here. And it's sometimes faster to scroll with the screen encoders. And like I showed you in the intro, there's support for MPE within kits. And I think this is one of the more impressive aspects of Push 3's MPE controls. The fact that you've now got multi-dimensional expressive control for each pad on an individual basis. The next big new thing about Push 3 is that Ableton now offers a standalone version of it, so I can actually disconnect it from my computer and from power actually, because it has a built-in battery, move into standalone mode, which takes a few seconds to boot up, so I'll speed this up, and I can now load up any of the projects that I transferred over here. It does seem to take a bit longer to load projects compared to my computer, so I'll speed this up as well. But now I've got essentially exactly the same project that I just showed you. Sounds the same, runs the same, has the same instruments. And I'll do a CPU stress test later on, but it's quite impressive what this can do. This basically runs the entire version of Ableton Live inside. In terms of processing power, inside Push 3 Standalone is an 11th gen Intel Core i3 processor with 8 gigs of RAM and 250 gigs of SSD storage. I installed quite a bit of content here and I've still got 198 gigs free. The specs on the battery say up to 2.5 hours. I found that if you use the CPU a lot, you'll get substantially less than that, but you can now use Push 3 as its own instrument without a computer, though of course there's a computer inside. What I think is most exciting about Push 3 Standalone is that in what I think is a very positive industry first, you can buy the controller-only version first and upgrade it to the standalone version using basically an upgrade kit that costs, I think, more or less the difference between the price of the controller and standalone version. And that kit basically just plugs a computer in the bottom. This also means that potentially the components of that computer could be more easily swapped, like memory, the processor, or hard drive, or in a few years, Ableton, or maybe an enterprising third party could come out with a new, more powerful upgrade kit. And then you could either replace that computer if you bought the standalone version, or if you bought the controller version, just install that computer in the bottom, and you've got a standalone Push 3 that's even more powerful than this one. Push 3 Standalone has Wi-Fi built into it for Ableton Link and transferring files over to it over the air. So you don't need to mess with SD cards or USB storage. Actually, it's the only way to transfer files to it currently. And the way you do it is that Push just appears in Ableton Live. You've got access to the user library, to projects. That's all the stuff I've got going on here. And you just drag and drop content into these folders. Push 3 Standalone can also connect to Ableton and download packs wirelessly. So these are all the packs that I've already downloaded, stuff from Spitfire Audio, and I've got access to all the available packs. So as not to keep you waiting too long, I'll pick a relatively small one. You start the download, downloads as expected, then you need to hit install when you're ready to install it, and that process also runs by pretty quickly. And it's now available for use. The next thing that's new for Push 3, regardless of whether you get the controller version or the standalone version, is that it now comes with a built-in audio interface. This interface has 2 balanced 1/4-inch audio inputs with separate level and gain control for each of the inputs. As you can see here, it's got 4 channels of outputs, 2 for the main left and right outputs and 2 more for the headphone outputs. You can choose from a bunch of sample rates and buffer sizes. Now both Push 2 and Push 3 have 2 pedal inputs, but Push 3's pedal inputs can also be used as CV output pairs. Now you'll need to buy a splitter like this and another adapter like this to put on the end. So this plugs into the pedal input and then you get 2 CV outputs per pedal jack. Then you just need to go into here and enable CV outs on the outputs that you want to use for CV. And then Push 3 comes with special CV instruments that let you sequence and control modular gear. And then Push 3 can also be expanded with 8 additional inputs and 8 additional outputs over ADAT. Beyond that, Push 3 has TRS MIDI inputs and outputs with dongles sold separately, so you'll need to get these TRS-A style dongles if you want to sequence 5-pin MIDI gear. And then push 3 also has a USB type A port to connect MIDI keyboards and controllers to it, and you can add more than one if you use a hub. Currently, you can't use that USB type A port for any other type of device besides controllers, so not for storage or Bluetooth MIDI devices. Hopefully they'll add support for additional devices later, like for example, even a keyboard. You can rename clips and tracks here, so just hit rename, but you sort of need to zip around using a jog wheel. Finally, push 3 has a USB Type-C port for connecting it to a computer. I haven't been able to charge it over USB-C or connect MIDI devices to it over USB-C. It would be nice if they add that in a future firmware update. Let's take a look at a few more differences between push 3 and push 2. The volume and tempo knobs are now push encoders, so you can change swing or tempo just by pressing this knob, and you can change the master volume, cue volume, and headphone output, here we go, by pressing and turning this knob. Then the main new star of the show is this encoder, which you'll probably use a lot. It's a push encoder, so you can use it to dive in to menus, and you can also push it left to go back in menus. And for certain lists, like project names, you can push it to the right to use it sort of like a right click to delete or rename projects. Another cool feature I wanted to show you with this, and there's a project I need in order to show you, so I'll just drag and drop it over here. Refresh this. Anyway, let's load this up. I'll fast forward this. It does take a while to load projects here. Hopefully they find a way to optimize that. Anyway, another new cool feature of push 3 in this encoder is that, yes, you can launch scenes and clips like this, but you can also look at the session grid and hence say move into note view here and launch entire scenes with this. Say, let's go into this scene. So you could be playing here, sequencing here, and launching scenes over here, which is pretty cool, I think. Other than that, you have a few new buttons on push 3. There's a selection button in the middle of this cursor pad. So you could select stuff. You've got the solo, mute, and stop clip buttons, but now also a lock option. There's save, project access, you saw that, a help or ideas menu. There's a new capture MIDI button. Ableton Live, like the government, is constantly listening. And if you played something nice and forgot to hit record, you hit capture MIDI and it will create a new clip for you. The add track and add device buttons have been consolidated into add. And you can add tracks or devices this way. And then the browse button has been swapped for a swap button if you want to swap out a device or explore presets. And I think everything else is very similar to push 2. So you've got device, mixer, clip, and the new session button. Beside that, push 3 has a few new screens compared to push 2, which hopefully they'll add to push 2. For example, this session view, I think it's really useful to see clip names, something you couldn't see before on the grid. And then if you go into clips, you can now edit clips using the edit clip feature. So this gives you a bit more flexibility that you didn't have before. You can select notes, edit them together, nudge them around, change their length, and so on. Select everything and edit that. So those are the main differences between push 3 and 2. It's important to say that a lot is still similar in terms of the performance and sequencing workflows, which I'll cover in a bit. The screen also seems very similar, if not identical. It's the same size, though it seems to me like the viewing angles on push 3 are slightly better, but the screen on push 2 is excellent in my opinion too, and I think it's a little bit brighter. Both have this touch strip to the left, which is a multifunction pitch bend mod wheel and transposition touch strip. It can also be assigned to other creative uses with Max for Live devices. The 8 encoders on top feel the same, and the 16 buttons above and below the screen also work exactly the same way. The buttons aren't quite as flush with the surface as in push 2, which I think is an improvement. Size-wise, the two are almost identical. Push 3 is about 2 centimeters or under an inch wider and extends a few millimeters up and down and above. Push 3 is heavier though, certainly the standalone version coming in at around 4 kilos or 8.7 pounds as opposed to 2.7 kilos or 6 pounds for push 2. And the push 3 controller version is slightly heavier, about 10% heavier than push 2. Okay, so that was push 3 versus push 2, and later on I'll discuss pros and cons compared to alternative competing products. But for those of you that aren't familiar with what push actually does, here's a brief overview. Push is a hardware interface for a software DAW called Live, both made by Ableton. In this case, in Push Standalone, that DAW is simply installed on a computer built in, but you could use it in controller mode or as a controller to control Ableton Live. What's special about Live and Push is that they're built around a clip launching, brainstorming, and performance workflow, all done through a session grid. And I can bring that up here too. So for example, you could brainstorm a few drum ideas in different clips, then add a different bass line to it, and swap that idea if you don't like it, or if you want it to be part of a chorus or a verse or a bridge. The idea is that you set up tracks represented as columns on this grid, kind of like how you'd put together a band or a synth and drum machine setup. And you can launch any clip in any row if you like, or decide that each row will be a different section of your song and use the C launchers to launch entire scenes. Then move to a different scene for a different part of your song. Move back and create your songs like that. If your song requires more than 8 tracks, no problem. You can shift the entire grid left and right and up and down if you want to brainstorm more ideas. So launching clips and scenes is one of the main purposes of this grid. The second main purpose is for playing notes or playing drums, depending on the type of track. If you're on a track with a melodic instrument, the main note layout lets you play notes across the entire grid. And if you're on a drum track, by default, you've got access to 16 pads. In the bottom left quadrant, if your kit has more than 16 pads, you can either move up and down the kit using the slider or swap out to a 64 pad layout. In this case, 16 is enough, so let's go back to this. If you're on a note grid, you can transpose the grid using the octave buttons. In this view, the root note of the scale has a different color, and notes within the scale are lit up, but you've got chromatic access to all the notes. Unless you want to disable that, you go into scale mode. There's also an in key mode, which only shows you notes in the scale, and you can swap out the scale and key if you like. And there are a few interval options for the rows. This is sort of like a bass guitar layout, but you can also do thirds and sequential, which in this case will give you an octave per row. Then you've got a few other performance options here. So say for the drum tracks, you've got repeats at different rates. And pads are velocity sensitive, unless you choose accent, which is basically maximum velocity. It would be nice, I think, if for the melodic tracks, instead of repeats, this would automatically add an arpeggiator device to the track. Right now it just does repeats. And that's pretty much how you use this as a performance grid. We'll talk about sequencing in just a bit. Before that, let's move on to the top portion of Push and talk about the screen and its controls. This particular screen is an exception, but for the most part, the row on the very bottom shows you what you can access by pressing the buttons on the bottom of the screen. Same goes for the row on the very top. So for example, here, I'm looking at the various devices in this device chain on this track. These are the devices on this track. You can also dive into group tracks if they're grouped, or into devices or device chains. So for example, I can see that I've got the simpler device here. If I press on this again, I dive into simpler, and then these will tab through various aspects of simpler as opposed to what they typically do, which is select tracks. Then finally, these encoders will typically control whatever's going on in the main section of the screen. So for example, here it's transpose. If the parameters change too fast for you, you can hold Shift for a more fine-tuned control. So that's how you control content that's already in the machine. Let's take a look at sequencing and start with live recording. You can arm tracks by long pressing them or by holding record and pressing a track. Before you sequence, you might want to set up a few things first, whether or not you want a metronome. So if I press this and it blinks, the metronome is on. And if I long press it, you can change a few metronome settings. So for example, get a 1-bar count in, change the sound, adjust the rhythm, and the time signature of the entire project. The next thing you might want to consider before you record is whether you just want to play endlessly and then decide when you want to stop recording, or record a fixed length clip. And you can choose the fixed length of that clip. If you don't choose a fixed length, just press record again to stop recording and finish the loop. Let's keep fixed length on, and then we can head into a track and practice to our heart's content. I can move into clip view to see what I'm recording and just hit record. And because I had fixed length on, the loop just starts repeating. Now I could either start a new idea by hitting new, let's look at the session, or just hit duplicate. I now have a copy of that and I can improvise on top of that. So let's say, maybe not record initially and just practice something. So each one repeats. Go into clip. If I'm ready to commit this, just hit record. Now I've got this clip with the hi-hats, and if I don't like that, I could just go back into the session grid to this clip and have my hi-hatless clip. You can see my timing was off here. If I'm unhappy with that, I can long press quantize to change the quantization settings, or just hit quantize once and everything gets quantized. I don't think that's necessary, so I'll undo that. And then I could go ahead to sequence a different track. So if I wanted to, say, add a bass to this, just go into here. Maybe you go into a chromatic scale, and I prefer the 4ths layout. So I just hit record, and let's say, that's my clip, by the way. And yeah, keep going. That's the workflow of Ableton Live, more or less. For recording live, you can also step sequence both melodies and drums, and you do that using the layouts option. So maybe let's go back to my drums first, because that's a bit more intuitive. And this is the sequencing layout. And in this case, since I've got 1 bar, then I've only got 16 steps. That's my sequence. I could say, add another kick here, or here. And yeah, just choose hi-hats. That's pretty boring, but we could do that. Yeah, recording live is so much more fun, but that's how you sequence. A few more things. You can make the pattern longer by extending it this way, say up to 4 bars. Let's keep it at 1 bar. There's another layout that lets you access different velocities. So you can place notes on the grid that way. You can also hold a note or one or more notes to edit their parameters. So say if I felt these were too loud, I could lower their velocity or nudge them around. We already talked about the edit function earlier, and step sequencing melodic tracks is very similar. You've got a few layouts for that here. You've got a step sequencing layout where half the pad grid lets you choose notes, and the other half lets you place them on the timeline wherever you want. Then there's another layout which just shows you notes, and you can go up and down the octaves. You can sort of see here, this little dot here shows you where you're at and where the notes are at, so you can find them pretty easily. You could add more notes to the timeline like that, and I dread to hear what that sounds like. Pretty good. I like this. If your pattern has more than 8 steps, you can obviously go back and forth like this. You can zoom in and out using these buttons. And if you don't want to page this way, then Shift and Layout turns the top row into a page selection button. One last important aspect of sequencing is automation, meaning the sequencing of parameters on a per step basis or over time. Now, we sort of looked at that a little bit. When you press down on the pads, we can change velocity and probability and the note length, but you can sequence, I think, any parameter in any device pretty much. So let's say, pick this and the auto pan. So let's first record this masterpiece. Hit record. That's our pattern, and this is what we want to automate. So to automate this, we just hit automate and make sure to turn on record, and we can now have this automated. Note the little dot that appeared that shows you this parameter is being automated. You can also step sequence automation. So if we hold the step, you can see the amount changes on a per step basis. And if we're not happy with a particular value, we can edit that. And what else? If we touch a knob that's being automated, the automation will stop. And we can get back to it by holding Shift and Automate. That turns that back on. And if we dislike an automation, just hold Delete and touch its knob, and it's gone. Unfortunately, currently there's no way to see the actual automation curves and fine-tune edit them like you can on Ableton Live. Hopefully they'll add that. And the last bit of push workflow that I wanted to show you is chopping up samples and slicing them. So I've got this sample here, and you can sample anything into audio clips on audio tracks or import WAV files. Now there's warping and different warping algorithms, and you can transpose clips and choose the start offset and so on. But the real fun begins when you hit convert and choose convert to simpler, and then go ahead and start slicing. So if we go into note mode, you'll see that simpler has kindly created all these slices for us. And we can start jamming away with this, or change the sensitivity to auto slice things differently. And there are different slicing modes. So here we're slicing by transient, but we can also slice by beat, region, or manual, which is a quick way to chop audio clips in real time. You just enter slice points manually. And if I don't like a slice point, I can nudge it around, zoom in to get things precise. It's very easy to get carried away doing this. And then always convert this to a drum rack and fine-tune things even more there. Once you've chopped a clip into a drum rack, you can then go ahead and add effects either to the entire rack or to individual pads. Let's just choose something quickly just to show you how easy it is to add devices into the chain. Let's say pick this. And then explore the device's parameters. Now, as I'm adding devices here, another important thing you need to be aware of is that there are three main versions of Ableton Live. Intro, which you get when you buy this, and then Standard, which costs a few $100s extra, and Suite, which is a few $100s on top of that. So as I navigate through the various devices here, you should be aware that the amount of instruments, sounds, and devices you see here is what you get when you get Ableton Live Suite. I won't go through all the differences in detail, but you can see there are plenty more software instruments and effects in Standard and Suite, including MIDI effects, which are always fun to experiment with. Now, Intro has a lot in it, as you can see here, and again, I won't go through everything in detail, but as we scroll down, you'll see that if you want more than 16 audio and MIDI tracks, you'll need to upgrade. Same goes for more than 16 scenes. If you use a lot of send and returns, be aware of that as well. And the list goes on. I think one of the main benefits of upgrading are the different instruments. And in particular, if you upgrade to Suite, you get Max for Live. which gives you access to a very large amount of devices, effects, both from Ableton and third-party devices, sequencers, audio and MIDI effects. All those are only in Ableton Suite. So be aware that beside the cost of Push on its own, you, like me, may be tempted to upgrade to Standard or Suite. So I think those are the main workflow and capability topics you need to be aware of before buying this or not. Maybe a few miscellaneous items. You can quickly access the master track by pressing this button. And when you're looking at the mixer, you've got a view into mixing tracks, or if you press this again, you've got control of the sends and the inputs and outputs. By default, the touch strip is a pitch bend, but if you hit select and tap it, then it becomes a mod wheel. And like I mentioned, you can customize this with Max for Live devices if you've got Suite. Select lets you select items without activating them. And you can also use it to select multiple tracks and then group them. Shift and here, group. So in case you wanted, you could do that. With Shift, you can change the color of clips or tracks, as well as if we hit Shift and choose a track, you can freeze or flatten tracks. So if a track is using up too much CPU power, you can cut that down. Let's also take a look at a few miscellaneous settings. I can see that I've been recording this for a while and my battery is pretty low, so I might as well plug this in. Anyway, you've got a few workflow controls. We talked about expression and sensitivity. We also reviewed audio. The MIDI tab lets you choose what you want to receive on the inputs or what you want to send out on the outputs. And if I add a controller here, it will appear. We talked about pedal controls. Wi-Fi lets you connect to your local network, and you can perform over-the-air updates using the software tab. Okay, let's talk about pros and cons and start with thoughts about Push 3 Standalone versus getting just the controller version of Push 3. On the pros side for Push 3 Standalone, as far as I can tell for the controller experience, you can do everything that you can do with a controller in Ableton Live on Push 3 Standalone. So it seems like a truly portable Push. Now, I didn't check anywhere near all of Live's features, but wherever I looked, I couldn't find something that I could do with a controller and a computer that I couldn't do with Push 3 Standalone. But, and this is an important but, Push 3's interface, whether standalone or controller, doesn't, at least not currently, give you access to anywhere near all of Ableton Live's features. Beyond that, the computer inside Push 3 doesn't give you a few important perks that you get when you use Push 3 as a controller with a regular computer. Let's talk about each of these two things separately. In terms of access to Live's features, yes, there may be a version of Live running in here, but you can't really access the arranger in a meaningful way. In order to stress test whether there's actually a full version of Ableton Live in Push 3 Standalone, I loaded up the full demo project that comes with Ableton Live onto here. Now, I've loaded the exact same project on my computer, so as you can see, this is an arranger-heavy project, and there's nothing on the session grid, and there's nothing on the session grid here either. But if I hit play, we can hear the project playing. So it's working in the background. Its devices are active. Let's say maybe you go into here. To me, everything sounds as it would on a computer, even though this is on the arranger. This entire project with its, I think, over 30 tracks all exists here. So these are all the devices and the device chains. Say, for example, on this track, you've got a drum rack, and in this track, you've got Simpler with these effects, and this track is an audio track, but these are the effects on the track. So these are all the devices that are available on each of these tracks. You can see there's quite a bit going on here. Compressors, EQs on each track, reverb, wavetable on this track. And we can actually play these. So this is the wavetable instrument on this track, operator here, and an arpeggiator with plastic toy here. All these things going on simultaneously with all these effects. Doesn't even seem like they bothered with return tracks here. Another wavetable with an arpeggiator. More instruments and effects. So yes, you can control all the devices on all these tracks, but if you hit clip, there's nothing there. You can't see what's going on in the arranger. By the way, if we did have clips here, we could hit shift and record and perform with the clips and the device controls into the arranger, but we couldn't see or edit what we recorded unless we hooked up to a computer. So no arranger access is a big limitation of Push Standalone, though of course you can control devices and the mix for all the arranger tracks. There's also no back to arranger button, so while you can load up and play a project from the arranger, if you launch a session clip, focus from the arranger will be taken on to the session, so there's no way to go back to the arranger if you want to return to the arranger audio. There's no access to locators. Now, there are workarounds for some of these limitations, like all kinds of MIDI mappings or Max for Live devices, but that's nowhere near proper arranger access and editing. Now, arrangement aside, there are also quite a few device and session-related features you don't have access to even using Push 3's hardware interface. For example, at least currently, you can't map macros or create racks within Push 3. You can't see Max for Live device graphics on the screen. Like I mentioned earlier, you can't view automation or MP sequencing curves on Push's screen. There's no interface for MIDI mapping to user mode or to any other external controller you want to connect to this. Now, you can set all these things up on your computer and then transfer that project to here, and it will work here, but you can't do that within the interface of Push 3. You also can't search for content, so yes, you can add devices and scroll through lists. By the way, there are plenty of things in a list. I found these to be a bit faster. Anyway, there's no search here through the controller, which would have been nice. You also can't edit follow actions. You can't edit clip trigger modes. You can't use variations on Push 3. You can't make A/B assignments to the various tracks if you want to work DJ style. And I'm sure there are other things that I've not tried yet. The thing is, the potential for all these capabilities exists right now, even in Push 3 standalone, because Live is still running under the hood. You just can't access it using the controller. Now, I don't know Ableton's roadmap for Push 3 other than they told me they plan to run with this for a long time, like they did with Push 2, so hopefully over time they'll develop access to these features via Push 3. An interesting stopgap solution could be, and I have no idea if they plan to implement this, would be to give us remote access to Push's internal computer, preferably over USB-C for high-speed access, or wirelessly. This way we could tweak a Push 3 set directly on the device as opposed to dragging projects over, say to make last-minute changes on the fly, or just to make sure that everything works as I expect on the hardware as opposed to testing it on my computer. Same goes for creating macros or MIDI mapping. It would just be nice to do everything on the device, even if it means using remote desktop. So feature access is one aspect of the differences between using Push 3 standalone versus a controller with a computer. Another important aspect of why Push as a controller with a computer is a better combo is the amenities you get when you use a computer. Just to name a few, the first thing that comes to mind is third-party plugins. Currently, there's no SDK for third-party plugins for Push 3 standalone, and even if there was, those would likely need to be ported because there's no Mac or Windows OS in here. When you're using Push 3 in controller mode with a computer, you can run any third-party plugin you like on your computer and control it using Push 3. That said, the exception to Push 3 standalone not running third-party plugins is that it does run Max for Live plugins natively if you get Ableton Live Suite. The only problem is, like I mentioned earlier, you can't see Max for Live device graphics here. And if the person that created the Max for Live device didn't map it to push controls, then you'll need to do that yourself as a macro, and the parameter names might not match up nicely depending on how that device is configured. Another benefit of using Push 3 as a controller with a computer is connectivity. The USB port in Push 3 standalone only supports MIDI devices, and while you can expand its I/O using ADAT, you can't currently connect third-party audio interfaces to it over USB, even if they're class compliant. It doesn't support USB storage devices nor Bluetooth MIDI, and it doesn't have an SD card reader, so the only way to move files back and forth is over Wi-Fi through Ableton Live. Again, all that currently. Since there's a computer in here, I can't imagine all these things are impossible, just a matter of priority. Then the last potential difference between using Push 3 standalone versus a controller with a computer is CPU power. Now, unfortunately, as of the version that I reviewed, there's no CPU or memory usage indicator on Push 3. I asked Ableton about this and they said that's planned, so that's good news, but they haven't developed that feature or finalized what the interface for it would look like as of the making of this video. Now, I kind of pushed them on this, if you don't mind the push pun, and they kindly gave me access to an in-house capability that lets you show CPU usage on the condition that I don't share what it looks like because it wasn't final and ready yet. Plus, this particular tool costs extra CPU cycles, so it's not a perfect test. Anyway, here's what I did to stress test Push 3 standalone, and you can also compare this at home if you've got a copy of Ableton Live with the factory default project. Anyway, the resting CPU usage of this project when it's not playing is 17%, so you can compare that to whatever you've got on your computer when you load it up. The instant I hit play, CPU usage on standalone goes to about 40%, and peak CPU usage that I saw when the verse starts, it jumps to between 50 to 68%, and then sort of stabilizes around 50 to 55%. By the way, I muted the audio of the song to avoid risking a copyright claim. Anyway, I did want to report that as I moved between the tracks of this song, I felt that Push 3 was a little bit sluggish, and sometimes the graphic visualizations and animations didn't show up. But in all fairness, I'm using a beta of Push 3 standalone, so hopefully things will improve in the final version. The most important thing, this very device and track heavy song sounds, as far as I could tell, exactly like it does on a computer. So it's a bit of an unfair comparison. I've got an M1 Max MacBook Pro here with 32 gigs of RAM, but based on these CPU numbers, I'd say it's only about 2.5 to 3 times more powerful as far as this project is concerned. Frankly, with just an i3 processor in here, I expected the difference to be more extreme. So to sum up the discussion of Push 3 standalone versus using it as a controller, you can currently do more with Push 3 in controller mode than a computer compared to Push 3 standalone. I think you should get Push 3 standalone only if you really don't want a computer in your setup, or portability is super important, grab and go, maybe with headphones, especially since Ableton plans to offer a reasonably priced upgrade kit, so you can always start with Push 3 controller and then upgrade to standalone later. Another interesting comparison we could make is, how does Push 3 compare to other Ableton Live controllers? That's a relatively easy question. Push 3 is the most expensive but best game in town. The integration with Ableton Live is far and beyond better than anything else out there. And now the addition of 3D expression control to the pads makes it an even more compelling companion to Ableton Live. Alternatives are, even if we put cost aside, not using a controller at all. Push 3 does take up space, and if you're fine with a mouse and keyboard, that's certainly an alternative. Beside that, noteworthy alternatives that don't have as tight an integration with Live but cost less are various controllers from Novation, Arturia, and Akai. Especially if you need a set of black and white keys, you may as well get one that has a few Ableton Live control perks, and that may be enough. Another comparison I know I'm going to be asked to make is, how does Push 3 fare compared to other production controllers/devices, and in particular MPC, Force, and Maschine? Now, that's material for an hour-long video that I just might make, but if I had to sum it up in a nutshell, Ableton Live as a software DAW can do way more than the underlying software in any one of these platforms. But historically, Ableton Live was designed from the ground up to be a fully featured DAW running on a computer, and then Push 1, 2, and 3 came later, increasingly adding more control features and functionality, but never giving you access to everything Live has to offer, at least so far. Force, MPC, and Maschine, on the other hand, were all designed with a more limited feature set, but it's still pretty comprehensive, and more importantly, all of them were designed exclusively with hardware control in mind. Force doesn't even have a software companion yet, though you can import MPC software projects into it, and while MPC and Maschine do have software versions, there are very few features in the software that you can't access from the hardware controllers. The thing that's probably most missing currently in Push 3, if we ignore Live's software interface, are song modes or arrangement capabilities on the controller. Force has a timeline-based arranger you can access from its screen. Maschine also has extensive arrangement features using scenes and clips, and MPC lets you change scenes in its song mode. You'll need access to Ableton Live's software to do all those things with Push 3. That said, an important advantage Push 3 now has over all these other platforms are its 64 MPE capable pads, giving you substantially more performance and expressive control compared to just velocity sensitive or pressure sensitive pads. Not to mention there are 64 of them as opposed to some of these which just have 4x4 grids. I think per pad 3D expression is a game changer for synths and drum machines, and Maschine and MPC now have to catch up in that respect These pads open up a world of performance possibilities. I also like the fact that you can expand Push 3 with 8 or more inputs and outputs via ADAT. Now you can expand the others I mentioned with audio interfaces, but you may encounter compatibility issues and experience more latency when doing so. If you're into standalone devices, the biggest pro for Push 3 is that you can start with a controller version, see if you like it, then upgrade to standalone. I think at pretty much the same price, even though some MPCs are less expensive standalone than just Push 3 as a controller. Finally, another way to look at Push 3 is just as a standalone expressive instrument or as an expressive controller. Here it competes quite nicely with the likes of Expressive E's Osmos, Rolly's Seaboard, Roger Lin's Linstrument, and Haken Audio's Continuum. First, you've got the option of having an almost endless array of built-in MPE synths, as opposed to some of these which are only controllers. Then, because each of these have a different approach to what expressive instrument controls should look like, it becomes a bit harder to compare. If you're into black and white keys, Osmos is probably the best choice. If you want to play a continuous fretless-like instrument, Continuum is kind of king of the hill, though pitch bends here are very smooth. It's just this little interval between the pads that you might get stuck on. Push 3 is probably most similar to Linstrument. Pros for Linstrument are that it has more pads or keys. It's got 2 versions that start with double the number of pads, a 16x8 grid and a bigger 20x8 version. And it's convenient that Linstrument's pads are sort of finger size. That said, Push 3's bigger pads give you finer control on an X and Y axis basis, which you don't quite get on Linstrument. I found that particularly useful in drum mode, where each of these is kind of like its own little drum, then hitting each pad in a different place produces a different sound. It's a fun performance tool, and it's also like having multiple kits within one kit. And I think that's a major differentiator for Push 3. So that's it for Push 3. There's so much more to cover. Let's continue the discussion in the comment section below. If you liked the insights in this video, there are plenty more in my ever-expanding book of electronic music ideas, tips, and tricks, available to the people who support this channel on Patreon. Hit like if this was useful. Ring the YouTube bell below if you want to make sure you don't miss the next one. Thanks for watching.